No country on earth has told more stories about pistols than the United States. In most nations, the pistol is an afterthought, a backup weapon. Not in America. Americans have always loved their sidearms. The sidearm has become more than a piece of equipment. It was romanticized as a cultural symbol, part of the American story. And long before these pistols got popularized in Hollywood or in video games, Americans saw them as symbols of independence, authority, survival, both on the frontier and at war. Today, we're going to talk about the history of the American service pistol from the Revolution to today. During the Revolutionary War, in the early years of the Republic, the primary sidearm for an American would have been a flintlock pistol. These were single-shot, muzzle-loaded weapons, like this Springfield 1795 musket with a flintlock. The soldier would half-cock the hammer, put in their powder, shut the spoon, then drop powder into the barrel, followed by a shot, full cock, and then there's a piece of flint stone right here, hence it being called a flintlock. And when you fire it, it sparks the powder, sending your ball down the barrel. The model 1775 would not have been called that at the time, as model designations didn't exist then as they do now. But the 1775 pattern would have been one of the first flintlock pistols used by Americans. A direct copy of the British model 1760, the model 1775 had a .62 caliber smooth bore. It was popular with officers due to its ease of use and relative accuracy for a smoothbore weapon. And the First Continental Congress ordered 2,000 of these pistols to be manufactured by the Rappahannock Forge in Virginia. Unlike later US pistols that had tighter specifications, the model 1775 is definitely a pattern of pistol, not a pistol with specific specifications that can be reproduced from factory to factory. During the Revolutionary era, pistols were contract made, often by multiple shops. And they were subject to variation in almost every dimension, from barrel length to lock markings to stock shaping. So when you're analyzing a 1775, you're often looking at a pistol that expresses more of a standard idea than a standardized specific blueprint. And this also extends to rifles, muskets, and swords of the era. And flintlock pistols, like the 1775, were used all the way through the War of 1812 and even the Spanish-American War. The next notable pistol to mention is the Harper's Ferry Model 1805. This pistol holds the distinction of being the first handgun manufactured by a U.S. national armory, rather than a private contractor. This is the #1 pistol on my list to add to this collection. It was conceived during the first standardization push, where the U.S. wanted domestic, repeatable patterns in arms production. Harper's Ferry and Springfield, an armory in Massachusetts, were the two big federal nodes for that effort. Critical note, Harper's Ferry was burned down. It was destroyed twice in 1861 and no longer exists during the Civil War, but that's for another video. The model 1805 during its time was called the Horseman's Pistol. They were produced in pairs with identical serial numbers. The initial batch produced 4,096 pistols. The 1805 is a .54 caliber smooth bore flintlock pistol. So we moved from a .62 caliber to a .54 caliber ball. And this would have been the standard issue pistol for the War of 1812. What's important here is the US proved that it could produce its own pistol in its own national armory. However, it exposed that the design was too refined for warfare, for cavalry use. It had a slender wrist stock that was prone to cracking, and producing at the armory was slow and expensive. There was a need for a larger scale and more ruggedness in the design. And the solution that the US came up with wasn't a better armory pistol, it was back to contract production, similar to the 1775. These pistols became the Model 1819. They were thicker in the wrist, heavier in the barrel, cruder in finish, and overall just less elegant. But this was not regression, it was adaptation. Because at the time, contractors could build the stronger guns faster, and at the time that was more important than absolute uniformity. And by the mid-1820s, the Model 1819 taught Americans two things. One, contract production can work. However, two, tighter tolerance control was needed. Which leads us to the model 1826, which really is the government saying, we're keeping contractor pistols, but we're locking down the pattern. So the model 1826 kept the improvements that were needed from the 1805 to the 1819, but shows finally that we're able to standardize production. The next major change is in 1842. This is when the American government switched from flintlock to percussion cap in both pistols and long arms. So the model 1842 replaced the 1826, ditching its flintlock for a percussion cap. Instead of using a flint stone to spark on steel and create a spark, the spoon of a flintlock was replaced with a nipple, basically a hole leading into the barrel, and a little percussion cap would be placed on the end of that nipple. Therefore, when the hammer comes down, it closes on the nipple, sending ignition into the barrel. The 1842 pistol doesn't see a long service life, but its impact is enormous. It normalizes percussion ignition in US service. It conditions soldiers and armorers for capped weapons. And it makes revolvers' advantages obvious almost immediately. And within the decade, multiple shot pistols make these previous pistols obsolete. The next doctrinal successor is the Colt revolver, beginning with the 1847 Walker and culminating in the 1851 Navy and 1860 Army revolvers. Similar to our previous model, being the 1842, the revolver still used percussion caps. However, instead of loading from the muzzle, you load each cylinder individually, up to 6 shots. This new technology, influenced heavily by Samuel Colt, dramatically increased a soldier's firepower, 6-fold. The Colt Walker, introduced in 1847, was designed by Samuel Colt with input from a Texas Ranger named Samuel Walker. The gun is massive, shoots a .44 caliber bullet, and saw service in the Mexican War. Samuel Walker told Colt that the new pistol needed to be able to kill a man or a horse, be decisive in mounted combat, and Samuel Colt obliged. It's big, it's heavy, and it takes up to 60 grains of black powder. This was the most powerful handgun in the world until the introduction of the .357 Magnum 90 years later. And this gun proved the concept of the military revolver, but not the execution. Next came the Colt Dragoon series, which is essentially a Colt Walker corrected by experience. It's still huge, it's still heavy, but more reliable and less prone to exploding. Think of the Dragoon as Colt learning that power without control is useless. So we still have a cavalry pistol, but now a more practical one. Which leads us to the Colt Model 1851, the first truly practical revolver. It was adapted by the US military in 1855. Nearly 17,000 of these were produced and delivered to the Ordnance Department. Most of these were used by mounted troops during the Plains War against Native Americans. And this gun shows us a philosophical shift. Unlike the Walker and the Dragoon, the 1851 is about carryability and shootability. It was a pistol that officers loved, civilians carried, lawmen trusted, soldiers privately purchased, and it was carried by Wild Bill Hickok. And it leads to this, the 1860 Colt, the peak of the percussion revolver. Back to .44 caliber from the .36 caliber 1851 and widely used in the American Civil War. The Colt 1860 is where everything comes together. It's a larger caliber on a more carry-sized frame, easier, more confident loading, and it's light and balanced. It's powerful and controllable. Lighter than the Dragoon for sure, faster handling, and more durable than the earlier guns. It's the maximum performance in a pistol possible before the open-top frame shows to become a limiting factor, and metallic cartridges make percussion caps obsolete. The US government ordered more than 220,000 of these for the Union forces. But before we move on to metallic cartridges, we need to discuss the Remington 1858. This Remington design has a closed-top frame design. Capitalizing on a fire that shut down the Colt factory in 1864, Remington heavily increased production of this .44 caliber cap and ball revolver. And many considered this Remington to be superior to the Colt, albeit more expensive. The main difference being the solid frame that completes a rectangle of material around the cylinder. It also does not have the takedown wedge of the Colt, allowing for quick cylinder swaps. So a soldier could carry multiple cylinders preloaded and swap them out quickly in combat. This is just the wave tops, and we will do a deep dive on cap and ball revolvers in a future video. There are a lot of arguments between who won between the Colt and the Remington. What it really comes down to is Remington won the philosophical battle of having a closed frame firearm, but in reality, Colt didn't lose. They adapted, because the next pistol on our list is another Colt. Following the Civil War, the development of self-contained metallic cartridges ushered in a new era of revolver design, leading to some of the most iconic firearms in American history. This is the Colt Single Action Army of 1873, known as the Peacemaker, the original Colt 45. The Colt Single Action Army in .45 caliber with its distinctive 7.5-inch barrel became the official sidearm throughout the Indian Wars up until 1892. While popular with soldiers, it also became an icon of the American West, favored by lawmen, outlaws, and civilians alike. You typically see this model with this 4.75-inch barrel, associated with the Wild West thanks to Hollywood. The Colt Single Action Army is not just a firearm. It's one of the clearest material symbols of American self-image. It's up there with the frontier cabin, the cavalry saber, and the Winchester rifle. Few objects sit so cleanly at the intersection of myth, violence, law, independence, and identity. It is pure Americana and deserves its own deep dive video very soon. But if we talk about the Colt Single Action Army, we need to talk about the Smith & Wesson Schofield. During the 1870s, the Army also purchased Smith & Wesson Schofield revolvers. Now, if you look at the Colt, you load it one round at a time, cock the hammer for every shot, and you eject the spent cases one by one. Nothing about it is fast by design. The Smith & Wesson answered the revolver problem very differently. Instead of a loading gate, it used a top break design. You snapped it open, and every spent cartridge ejected at once. Reloading was faster, simpler, and way easier to teach. For a cavalryman reloading on horseback, the Schofield made way more sense. And from a purely military perspective, it was very arguably superior. And the Army agreed. They adopted it and standardized their ammunition choice around it. Schofield isn't romantic, but it's efficient. And here's where the story gets quietly revealing. The Single Action Army uses the .45 Colt cartridge. The Schofield used a shorter .45 Smith & Wesson cartridge. And the Army standardized around the shorter one because you could technically put it in both guns. And that's not about gunfighting, that decision's about logistics. And that tension runs straight through American history. It's still debated today. The Army chose what was practical, but American culture chose what felt right. But come 1892, with our next pistol, that discussion didn't really matter anymore. Or did it? That's foreshadowing. The late 19th century saw a shift away from the single-action revolvers that had dominated the American West. And the primary replacement for the Colt Single Action Army was the Colt 1892, the first general issue, double action, swing out cylinder to be used by the US military. The 1892 was chambered in 38 Colt. Britain, France, and other European powers were moving to double action revolvers, and it made sense for the US to do the same. This is a radical break from gate-loaded rod ejector designs that came before. And this is not refinement of this, it's a philosophical leap forward. However, the anemic performance of the .38 cartridge during the Philippine-American War proved its inadequacy for combat. You see, during the Philippine-American War, soldiers reported that multiple hits from a .38 caliber pistol round failed to stop assailants, particularly notorious during encounters with Moro juramentados. Sorry if I said that wrong. Moro juramentados refers to Moro Muslim warriors from the southern Philippines who undertook premeditated suicide attacks, often called Mag Sabil, against Spanish, American, or Japanese forces during colonial conflict. fighting with bladed weapons in a religious-motivated form of jihad or extreme patriotism. Moro refers to various indigenous Muslim ethnic groups of the southern Philippines, a term imposed by the Spanish, but now also reclaimed. Juramentado, Spanish for sworn, a warrior who takes an oath, juramentar, to fight to the death, often after rituals to avenge his people or chief against invaders. We'll talk more about them in a Colt double-action deep dive video. The .38 Colt, being anemic, led to the military reissuing stocks of the older, more powerful Colt single-action armies into the Philippines, commonly with the 5.5-inch barrel, or the artillery models. Which really differentiates the Colt double action compared to the single action are that you can fire it in double action, or you can cock the hammer manually and have a nice smooth trigger pull like the single action. So this gives you the option of having that really nice single action trigger or being able to fire quickly with a longer, heavier pull. It also has a swing out cylinder, making loading and unloading very easy. It's a much faster and more efficient system than the Colt single-action army, which requires each cartridge to be loaded and unloaded one at a time. The 1892 saw upgraded iterations. There was an 1892, an 1894, 1895, 1896, 1901, and 1903. The notable improvements over time are a stronger lock and mechanical refinement. But none could fix the issue about the .38 just being an anemic cartridge. A light .38 revolver was being asked to do a .45 caliber job. There's no replacement for displacement. In addition to the Army reissuing the older Colt single-action armies in .45 Colt, about 4,600 would be issued for the American forces in the Philippines. Now, when I brought up foreshadowing a little while ago, the Army had ditched the .45 long Colt for the .45 Smith & Wesson cartridge, and now they're right back to the .45 long Colt. Colt always wins. And now we go to sort of a transitional era. The experience in the Philippines solidified the military's decision to stick with the .45 caliber pistol cartridge. In 1909, the Army adopted Colt's new service revolver and designated it the Model 1909. This bridged the gap between the weaker .38 and the future .45 ACP in the 1911. It was essentially the Colt Model 1902s that were being purchased, but standardized for military use. In essence, the period in time between the Colt single-action army and the Colt model of 1911 was a dynamic period. It saw the US military embrace modern revolver design in the 1892, only to discover that its ammunition was not adequate, which led to the adoption of basically the same design back in the .45 long Colt and paving the way for the legendary 1911 in .45. The 1909 has a very narrow service window of 1909 to 1911. But before we get to 1911, we need to jump to 1917 and back again. This pistol that I've been displaying to discuss 1892 to 1909 is actually in 1917. You see, during World War I, the demand for the 1911 pistol outstripped supply. To supplement this, both Colt and Smith & Wesson were contracted to produce large caliber revolvers in the .45 ACP. Colt won again. This was the same cartridge used in the 1911, and both the Smith & Wesson and the Colt were designated M1917. Since the .45 ACP of the M1917 is a rimless design, you can't simply drop your rimmed cartridge into the cylinder and expect it to stay there. So the trick that was used is to have both full moon and half moon clips, which would hold 3 and 3, to prevent the .45 ACP from falling through the cylinder. This M1917 happens to be a Smith & Wesson. Based on my research, the Colt is known for having a bit of a heavier trigger pull than the Smith & Wesson, a more rounded grip profile, slightly more robust lock work, and uses the Colt new service frame that we've been discussing. This Smith & Wesson model is known for having a smoother double action, more of a square butt profile, and uses the N frame, which is the ancestor of the .44 Magnum revolvers. Both the Colt and Smith & Wesson are rugged, accurate, and entirely serviceable, but shooters did notice the difference. Colt produced approximately 151,000 between 1917 and 1918, and Smith & Wesson produced approximately 163,000 between 1917 and 1919, with some being delivered after the armistice. We'll talk more about these guns in their own video. After a series of trials and tests and tribulations, the U.S. Army adopted the Colt model of 1911 on March 29, 1911. Designed by the brilliant John Moses Browning, the M1911 was chambered in the new .45 ACP that we just discussed, standing for Automatic Colt Pistol. The cartridge was also designed by Browning, and the pistol was produced by Colt. Colt always wins. The 1911 uses a short recoil, tilting barrel system, which is strong enough to handle the pressures of .45 ACP, simple locking geometry, and proven in earlier Browning automatic designs. It has a single action trigger, giving it a consistent pull, giving it excellent shootability under stress, and a superior hit probability over the double action trigger pull, which is very long and heavy. Not only does the pistol have a thumb safety, but it has a grip safety. This was because most pistol users were cavalry, and cavalry wanted this. It's important to note that the 1911 wasn't chosen for elegance, although it probably is the most elegant pistol in the world, in my opinion. They chose it because it kept working when the others didn't. By the end of the trials, the Colt Browning pistol had fewer stoppages, required less maintenance, and survived endurance testing with minimal breakages compared to its competition. The Army asked, "Which pistol would you trust your life to after weeks in the field?" The answer was unambiguous. The 1911 was robust, reliable, and a powerful weapon. It served as the standard issue pistol for Americans for 74 years, seeing action in World War I, World War II, 2 World Wars, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and beyond that with special units. This pistol was issued at a massive scale during World War I to soldiers with wildly different hand sizes and was put under long periods of stress in very harsh conditions. And feedback came from our doughboys, cavalrymen, MPs, officers, armorers, and everyone had similar complaints. The gun shoots low, the trigger reach is long, the hammer bites your hand, and it's hard to shoot quickly if you have smaller hands. And none of these were failures, they were ergonomics complaints, and the Army approached the problem pragmatically. There was no caliber change, no action change, no safety change, no magazine change, because the pistol proved itself in combat, and messing with that core design would have broken what worked. So it went under some minor changes in 1924, resulting in the M1911 A1 pistol. The changes included a shorter trigger, frame scallops for your finger to be able to reach the trigger better, an arched mainspring housing to address people shooting low because it naturally makes you point a little higher, a longer grip safety spur to prevent hammer bite, and it got some plastic grips, but overall it's the same pistol. There are other minute changes, especially between company to company, that was making them for World War II, and there will be an autistically deep video on all of this, I promise. When people think of the invasion of Normandy, close-range warfare in Korea and Vietnam, they picture this 1911 A1. The 1911 series as a whole is my favorite pistol since I was a wee little child. And I have a lot of them. In 1985, the US military decided to standardize with its NATO allies, and this meant moving to the 9mm cartridge, which in hindsight is weird after what we've discussed going back to .45 because stopping power. But that's where we are. 1911 A1s were decades old, worn out, beat up. The pistols that were used throughout Korea, Vietnam, and forward in every combat action through the 1980s, the guns were built during World War II. And since our NATO allies were all standardizing on one cartridge, it was time for the United States to do the same. So we launched the XM9 trials to pick the next American sidearm. And this led to the adoption of the Beretta 92 FS, designated the M9. The M9 was a modern pistol, high capacity, 15 rounds instead of the 7 or 8 in the 1911, so double. And similar to our revolvers from 1892 to 1917, you have a double action or single action. While the M9 served for more than 30 years, it was not without its controversies. Some soldiers expressed concerns about the 9mm stopping power compared to our .45s of old. Actually, if you look at this table, you got 44, 44, 45, 45, 45, 45. and then 9, which is it's like about a 38, I believe. But technology improves. 9mm gets better over time, especially today. And issues that this gun faced were addressed over time. The M9 isn't a frontier mythological weapon like the Colt single-action army. It's not a legend maker like the 1911. It's a bureaucratic coalition-era sidearm. It still becomes iconic because Americans love sidearms, and we imprint stories of whatever we're carrying in our holster. I used this pistol in the service and have both good and bad memories of it. I already have a deep dive on this, so go ahead and check it out. And while you're at it, let me know what you'd like introduced to future deep dives. After the M9, we enter the current era of American military sidearms. Enter the age of modularity. By the mid-2000s, the military was ready to replace the Beretta for several reasons. Mainly the desire of modularity, the ability to fit different hand sizes, compatibility with modern optics, compatibility with modern accessories, and lower long-term maintenance costs. So the Army launched the Modular Handgun System, or the MHS program, which was one of the most competitive handgun trials in US history. Oh, and they wanted tan apparently, lots of tan. In 2017, the US Army announced that the winner of the MHS program was the 6 Sauer P320, designated in full size as the M17 and the compact as the M18, which basically just cut this extra slide off, and that's what you get for the M18. Chambered in 9mm NATO, the US adopted its own plus P 124 grain cartridge that is very lethal and makes 9mm a very powerful cartridge. It would definitely do its job on a Moro warrior in the Philippines. These pistols are now being issued to all branches of United States Armed Forces. And this gun represents a new era of Americans and our love for sidearms. Compared to these old revolvers, look how far ergonomics have come, ensuring that we have options as US warfighters. I already put a video out on the M17 as well, so go check it out and tell me what you think. From flintlock pistols carried during the Revolution to our modular service handguns of today, the American service pistol has never really been treated as a secondary weapon. In the United States, pistols are iconic. As we sit in the 250th year of the United States of America, we see 2.5 centuries of Americans transforming the sidearm into a symbol of independence on the frontier, authority in a uniform, and survival when everything else failed. The technology changed, the doctrine evolved, and the pistols themselves were replaced again and again. But the place of the handgun in the American story will never be replaced. Thanks for watching.